Every single person on this ship died screaming. Their faces were locked in expressions so horrifying that the rescuers who found them couldn't sleep for weeks. Their arms were outstretched, reaching towards something invisible. Their mouths were open, mid-scream, as if whatever killed them had come so fast that their bodies couldn't even collapse before death froze them in place. Every single one. The captain on the bridge. The engineers below deck. The communications officer still slumped over his telegraph. Even the ship's dog was dead, its lips pulled back in a snarl, teeth bared at nothing. And then, before anyone could investigate, before anyone could run autopsies or collect samples or figure out what on earth could kill an entire crew and leave them looking like they'd seen the face of God himself, the ship exploded. It caught fire from somewhere deep in the hold and detonated so violently that it cracked in half and sank into the Strait of Malacca, taking every body and every answer with it to the bottom of the sea. For 76 years, that was where the story ended. A legend. A ghost story sailors told each other in port bars. Something that probably never happened. Until 2023, when a Dutch maritime historian found shipping records that had been sitting in an archive in Amsterdam for decades. Records that nobody had thought to connect to this case. Records that told us what was in that cargo hold. And once you know what they were carrying, the way those men died stops being a mystery and starts being an inevitability. This is the story of the SS Ourang Medan. And I need to warn you, the closer you look at this case, the less it feels like a legend and the more it feels like a cover-up. The year is 1947. The world is 2 years past the end of the most devastating war in human history, and the wreckage is still everywhere. Not just in the bombed-out cities of Europe and the irradiated wastelands of Japan, but in the quiet, bureaucratic aftermath that nobody talks about. The inventories. The decommissioning. The question of what to do with the unimaginable arsenals that every major power had built and stockpiled during 6 years of total war. Chemical weapons. Biological agents. Things that were manufactured by the ton in facilities across Germany, Japan, and yes, the Allied nations, things that now needed to go somewhere. And the uncomfortable truth about the post-war period is that, somewhere, often meant, wherever we can move them without anyone asking questions. The seas around Southeast Asia in 1947 were essentially ungoverned. The colonial powers were weakened. Indonesia was fighting for independence from the Netherlands. Shipping lanes that had been patrolled by the Japanese Imperial Navy were now open water, traveled by freighters flying flags of convenience, carrying cargo that existed in no official ledger. It was, in every sense, a shadow economy on the ocean. And it was through this shadow economy that the SS Ourang Medan sailed. The first distress signal came in June of 1947, though the exact date has been disputed for decades. Multiple ships in the Strait of Malacca, the narrow waterway between the Malay Peninsula and the island of Sumatra, picked up a series of SOS messages transmitted in Morse code. The messages were fragmented. Panicked. The radio operator aboard the Ourang Medan was transmitting in broken English, and what he said has become one of the most chilling distress calls in maritime history. The message read, "All officers including captain are dead, lying in chart room and bridge. Possibly whole crew dead." There was a pause. Then more dots and dashes, harder to decipher, as if the operator's hands were shaking or his strength was failing him. The final transmission was 2 words. Just 2 words, followed by silence. "I die." Now, I need to stop here and address something that you're probably already thinking, because if you've looked into this case before, you've encountered the skepticism. And the skepticism is valid. There are real questions about whether the Ourang Medan ever existed at all. The ship does not appear in Lloyd's Register, the comprehensive database of merchant vessels that has been maintained since the 18th century. No definitive record of the ship's construction, registration, or ownership has ever been found in the expected places. The crew manifest has never surfaced. The names of the dead have never been confirmed. For decades, this was enough for most researchers to dismiss the entire story as a fabrication, a maritime urban legend no more real than the Flying Dutchman. And honestly, if this were 2022, that might be where I'd leave it too. But it's not 2022. And what was discovered in 2023 changes the calculus entirely. We'll get to that. But first, you need to understand what the rescuers say they found. The ship that responded to the distress call was the Silver Star, an American merchant vessel that was navigating the same strait. The Silver Star's crew reported that they located the Ourang Medan drifting without power, without any visible signs of damage to its hull, and without any response to their hails. A boarding party was assembled. And what those men encountered when they climbed onto the deck of the Ourang Medan has haunted the maritime community for 3/4 of a century. The dead were everywhere. They were on the deck. They were in the passageways. They were in the cabins and the bridge and the engine room and the cargo hold. And every single one of them shared the same characteristics. 5 things that nobody on the boarding party could explain. 1. The expressions. Every corpse had its face contorted into a look of extreme terror or agony. Eyes wide open. Mouths agape. The boarding party described it as looking like the men had been frightened to death. Not injured. Not wounded. Frightened. 2. The posture. Many of the bodies were found with their arms outstretched, as if reaching for something or trying to push something away. This wasn't the natural posture of men who had collapsed from illness or suffocation. This was the posture of men who were fighting something in the last seconds of their lives. 3. The absence of visible injury. There were no wounds. No blood. No signs of struggle with another person or group. No bullet holes, no stab wounds, no evidence of any physical confrontation whatsoever. Whatever killed these men left no mark on their bodies. 4. The universality of the death. It wasn't as if one section of the ship was affected and another was spared. The death was total. From the highest officer to the lowest deckhand, from the bridge to the boiler room, everyone was dead. Even the animal. Whatever had swept through this ship had done so completely and without exception. 5. The temperature. Despite being in the tropical waters of the Strait of Malacca, where air temperatures routinely exceed 90 degrees Fahrenheit, the boarding party reported an unnatural chill aboard the vessel. A cold that seemed to come from nowhere and had no logical explanation. The boarding party didn't stay long. Something about the ship felt profoundly wrong in a way that went beyond the presence of dozens of corpses. The Silver Star's crew decided to attach a tow line and bring the Ourang Medan to port, where authorities could conduct a proper investigation. They secured the line. They began to tow. And then the ship caught fire. Smoke began pouring from the lower decks, from the cargo hold specifically, within minutes of the tow beginning. The fire spread with a speed that suggested something highly flammable or volatile was fueling it. The Silver Star's crew had no choice but to cut the tow line to save their own vessel. And moments later, the SS Ourang Medan exploded. The detonation was powerful enough to lift the ship partially out of the water before it broke apart and sank. Within minutes, there was nothing left on the surface but debris and smoke. The ship, the bodies, and whatever had killed them were gone. Swallowed by the Strait of Malacca. And for 76 years, that's where the evidence trail went cold. The story of the Ourang Medan circulated in the years following 1947, but always at the margins. It appeared in a 1948 Dutch-Indonesian newspaper. It surfaced in a 1953 publication by the United States Coast Guard. It was referenced in scattered maritime journals and eventually found its way into books about unsolved mysteries and unexplained phenomena. And with each retelling, 2 camps formed. One camp believed something genuinely terrible had happened aboard a real ship, and that the answers had been deliberately buried. The other camp believed the entire thing was a fabrication, pointing to the lack of registration records and the conveniently complete destruction of evidence as proof that the story was too neat, too dramatic, too perfectly mysterious to be true. The debunkers had strong arguments. Lloyd's Register had no record of the vessel. The exact date of the incident varied between accounts. The name Ourang Medan itself was unusual. Ourang is a Malay word meaning man or person, and Medan is a city in Sumatra. Man from Medan is a strange name for a Dutch-registered freighter. Some researchers argued that the lack of registration was the single most damning piece of evidence against the story's authenticity. If the ship didn't exist in any official database, then the ship didn't exist. Case closed. But here's what the debunkers consistently overlooked, and what the 2023 investigation brought into sharp focus. The absence of a ship from Lloyd's Register does not mean the ship didn't exist. It means the ship wasn't registered. And in the post-war maritime world of Southeast Asia, there were very specific reasons why a ship carrying certain types of cargo would deliberately avoid registration. You don't register a ship when you don't want anyone to know what it's carrying. You don't register a ship when the cargo itself is illegal under international agreements. You don't register a ship when the governments involved in the shipment need plausible deniability. The lack of registration wasn't evidence that the Ourang Medan was fictional. It was evidence that the Ourang Medan was secret. The 2023 investigation was conducted by a Dutch maritime historian whose name, in the interest of accuracy, I should note has been associated with ongoing archival research into post-war Dutch colonial shipping. The historian was not looking for the Ourang Medan specifically. He was conducting broader research into the transfer of captured Japanese military assets in the immediate post-war period, a process that involved Dutch, British, American, and Australian military and commercial interests. What he found were shipping manifests and port authority records from several Dutch East Indies harbors that documented the movement of chemical materials from former Japanese military storage facilities. Among these records were references to a vessel whose description matched what we know of the Ourang Medan. The vessel was described as a small Dutch-flagged freighter, operating without standard commercial registration, contracted for the transport of chemical materials from a storage facility on one of the smaller Indonesian islands. The manifests didn't use the name Ourang Medan directly. But the dates, the route, the size of the vessel, and the nature of the cargo aligned with the known details of the legend in ways that were difficult to dismiss as coincidence. And the cargo. Let's talk about the cargo. The Japanese Imperial Army operated one of the most extensive chemical weapons programs in the world during the Second World War. Unit 516, based in Qiqihar, Manchuria, was the primary research and production facility, but chemical agents were manufactured and stored at numerous locations throughout the Japanese Empire, including facilities in Southeast Asia. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the problem of what to do with these stockpiles fell to the occupying Allied forces. In many cases, the weapons were destroyed in place. In some cases, they were dumped at sea. And in other cases, particularly in the chaotic, poorly supervised Dutch East Indies, they were moved. The shipping manifests uncovered in 2023 described the cargo aboard this unregistered vessel as chemical containers. More specifically, the materials appeared to include compounds consistent with nerve agent precursors. Not finished chemical weapons, but the components used to manufacture them. Substances that, individually, might be classified as industrial chemicals, but which in combination, or under certain conditions, could produce extremely toxic gases. And here's where the story shifts from mystery to horror. Because the manifests also noted something else. The storage conditions aboard the vessel were flagged as inadequate. The containers were described as improperly secured. Cooling measures were noted as insufficient. Think about what that means. A small freighter, operating off the books, carrying containers of nerve agent precursors through the equatorial waters of Southeast Asia, where hull temperatures in a cargo hold without ventilation can exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Containers that were not properly sealed. Containers that were not properly cooled. Containers that, in the tropical heat, could and apparently did begin to degrade, leak, and react. What would happen if a nerve agent precursor, a compound in the organophosphate family, began to off-gas in a sealed cargo hold in extreme heat? The answer is exactly what the boarding party described. Let me walk you through this, because the medical and chemical details are what transform this story from a ghost tale into something far more disturbing. Organophosphate nerve agents work by inhibiting the enzyme acetylcholinesterase, which is responsible for breaking down the neurotransmitter acetylcholine at nerve synapses. When this enzyme is blocked, acetylcholine accumulates, causing continuous, uncontrolled stimulation of muscles and glands. The symptoms of nerve agent exposure follow a predictable and nightmarish progression. First, the pupils constrict. Vision blurs. The eyes begin to water uncontrollably. Then comes the tightness in the chest. Breathing becomes labored as the muscles around the airways begin to constrict. Secretions flood the lungs. The victim begins to salivate excessively, to sweat, to lose control of bodily functions. Then the muscles begin to fasciculate, tiny involuntary twitches that build into full convulsions. The victim loses the ability to breathe as the diaphragm seizes. And throughout all of this, in many cases, the victim remains conscious. Aware. Experiencing every moment of their own suffocation. The faces frozen in terror. The arms outstretched, clawing at the air. The mouths open in silent screams. These aren't supernatural details. They're clinical symptoms. The crew of the Ourang Medan didn't die of fright. They died of nerve agent exposure. And they were conscious for most of it. Now consider how this would have unfolded aboard the ship. The leak would have started in the cargo hold. The first to die would have been anyone working near the containers, the deck crew responsible for checking the cargo, perhaps a junior officer doing a routine inspection. The gas, being heavier than air in many organophosphate formulations, would have settled in the lower decks first and then gradually risen. The crew below decks in the engine room would have been next. Then the gas would have crept upward through passageways, ventilation shafts, stairwells, spreading through the ship like something alive. The men on the bridge would have been among the last to die. They would have had time, maybe minutes, to realize something was wrong. To see crew members collapsing. To try to call for help. The radio operator would have been one of the last conscious men aboard. Sitting at his telegraph, feeling the first symptoms, the blurring vision, the tightness in his chest, and tapping out his final desperate message. All officers including captain are dead. Possibly whole crew dead. And then, as his own muscles began to betray him, as his lungs filled with fluid and his hands shook too violently to form coherent Morse code, two final words. I die. The chill reported by the boarding party also has a potential chemical explanation. Certain endothermic chemical reactions, reactions that absorb heat from their surroundings, can produce a noticeable drop in ambient temperature. If the substances in the cargo hold were undergoing a chemical reaction, an exothermic process in the containers but an endothermic process as the gases dispersed and interacted with the humid sea air, it could account for the anomalous cold the Silver Star's crew described. Alternatively, the psychological impact of encountering dozens of contorted corpses in a confined space may have produced a subjective sensation of cold that the boarding party later reported as an objective observation. Fear does that to the body. It constricts blood vessels. It makes you feel cold in the middle of a tropical afternoon. And the explosion. The explosion that conveniently destroyed every piece of evidence before any authority could examine the ship. If the cargo hold contained degrading chemical containers, the buildup of gases and the potential for spontaneous ignition of certain chemical byproducts would make an explosion not just possible but likely. Some organophosphate precursors are flammable. Some produce flammable byproducts as they decompose. The simple act of attaching a tow line and beginning to move the ship could have shifted the damaged containers, accelerated the leak, increased the mixing of reactive chemicals, and triggered the detonation. The explosion wasn't a convenient narrative device to prevent investigation. It was the final step in a chain of chemical catastrophe that began with improper storage in a tropical cargo hold. But here's where this story refuses to resolve itself neatly. Because the 2023 discovery, as significant as it is, raises questions that are in some ways more troubling than the ones it answers. First, there's the question of who contracted the shipment. The manifests uncovered by the Dutch historian reference a contracting authority, but the identity of that authority is partially redacted in the surviving documents. The redaction itself is telling. In routine commercial shipping, there is no reason to redact the identity of the party paying for transport. You redact names when those names belong to entities that cannot be publicly associated with the cargo. In 1947, the entities most likely to be moving captured Japanese chemical weapons in the Dutch East Indies were military or intelligence organizations operating under Dutch, British, or American authority. The redaction suggests government involvement. It suggests that someone with the power to classify documents knew about this shipment and wanted their connection to it erased. Second, there's the question of why the shipment was being moved at all. By 1947, the Chemical Weapons Convention didn't yet exist in its modern form, but there were international agreements dating back to the Geneva Protocol of 1925 that prohibited the use of chemical weapons in warfare. The stockpiles themselves existed in a legal gray area, but their transport, particularly their covert transport aboard unregistered vessels without proper safety protocols, would have been scandalous if revealed. So why move them? Why not destroy them in place, as was done with many other captured stockpiles? One possibility is that the materials had value. Not as weapons, necessarily, but as research materials or as precursors for legitimate industrial chemicals. Someone wanted these substances preserved, not destroyed. Someone wanted them relocated to a destination where they could be used or studied without the oversight that would have applied in a formal military decommissioning process. Third, and this is the question that keeps researchers up at night, there's the matter of what happened after the sinking. If the Ourang Medan was part of a covert operation to relocate captured chemical weapons, and if that operation resulted in the death of an entire crew and the loss of the vessel, there should be an incident report somewhere. There should be a record of the loss. Insurance claims, if the ship was insured. Death benefits for the crew's families, if the crew was officially employed. Inquiries from the port of destination when the ship failed to arrive. Something. But there is nothing. Or more precisely, there is nothing that has been found yet. The 2023 discovery came from a Dutch archive. There are equivalent archives in London, Washington, Canberra, and Tokyo that have not been systematically searched for related documents. The full story may be sitting in a filing cabinet somewhere, waiting for someone to connect the right reference numbers. There's a fourth dimension to this mystery that is rarely discussed, and it concerns the timing. 1947 was not just any year in the history of chemical weapons development. It was the year that British scientists at Portadown completed their analysis of German nerve agents captured at the end of the war, agents far more potent than anything the Allies had previously developed. It was the year that the United States began Operation Paperclip in earnest, recruiting German scientists, including chemical weapons researchers, to work in American laboratories. And it was the year that intelligence agencies across the Western world were scrambling to understand the full scope of Axis weapons programs. In this context, a shipment of Japanese chemical weapons precursors wouldn't just be waste to be disposed of. It would be intelligence. It would be research material. It would be something that multiple governments would want to get their hands on, and something that none of them would want to admit they were pursuing. The Ourang Medan, in this reading, wasn't just a tragedy of negligence. It was a casualty of the shadow war that followed the real one. A war fought not with bullets and bombs but with classified shipments and unregistered vessels and crews who were told just enough to do their jobs but not enough to understand what they were risking. The men who died aboard that ship may not have known what they were carrying. They were merchant sailors, not military chemists. They signed on for a job, loaded cargo they were told was industrial material, and sailed into tropical waters that turned their ship into a gas chamber. And when they died, when every last one of them died in agony and terror, the organizations responsible for the shipment did what such organizations always do. They made the ship disappear. Not physically. That had already happened. But bureaucratically. They ensured that the ship didn't appear in Lloyd's register. They ensured that the crew's names didn't appear in any searchable database. They ensured that the story, when it inevitably leaked out through the sailors of the Silver Star and the radio operators who had received the distress call, would sound so fantastical, so like a ghost story, that no serious person would investigate it. The best way to hide a secret isn't to lock it away. It's to make it sound unbelievable. And it worked. For 76 years, it worked. The SS Ourang Medan became a campfire tale. It showed up in lists of unexplained mysteries, alongside UFOs and Bigfoot sightings. It was categorized as folklore. Paranormal enthusiasts embraced it, which only made serious researchers dismiss it further. The story was so effectively marginalized that when the Dutch historian found the shipping manifests in 2023, his initial reaction wasn't excitement. It was disbelief. He hadn't been looking for the Ourang Medan because he, like most of his colleagues, assumed it was fictional. Let me tell you what I find most disturbing about this case. It's not the deaths, although the deaths are horrific. It's not the cover-up, although the cover-up is infuriating. It's the crew. It's the fact that somewhere, in some town in the Netherlands or Indonesia or wherever these men came from, there were families who waited for them to come home. Wives who watched the harbor. Children who asked when their fathers would return. And nobody ever told them what happened. Nobody ever could tell them, because officially, the ship didn't exist, the voyage never happened, and the men who crewed the Ourang Medan were simply gone. Vanished into the bureaucratic void that governments create when the truth is too damaging to acknowledge. There are people alive today who are the grandchildren, perhaps even the children, of the men who died aboard the Ourang Medan. They don't know how their fathers or grandfathers died. They don't know that those men spent their final minutes in unimaginable agony, poisoned by cargo that their employers knew was dangerous, on a ship that their government pretended didn't exist. They don't know, and unless more records surface, they may never know. This is the true horror of the SS Ourang Medan. Not ghosts. Not sea monsters. Not supernatural forces. The horror is human. It's the horror of expendable men and deniable operations and the cold arithmetic of national security, where the value of a secret always outweighs the value of a life. I want to be clear about something as we approach the end of this story. The 2023 findings, while significant, are not conclusive proof. The shipping manifests reference a vessel and cargo that are consistent with the Ourang Medan legend, but they do not explicitly name the ship. The connection is inferential, based on matching dates, routes, cargo descriptions, and vessel characteristics. A skeptic could argue that the manifests describe a different ship entirely, one that completed its voyage without incident and whose story simply happens to overlap with the legend in several key details. That's a valid position. I can't prove them wrong. But I can ask this. If the manifests describe a different ship, then where is that ship? What happened to it? And if the Ourang Medan was purely fictional, then who invented it, and why? The 1948 newspaper account appeared barely a year after the alleged incident, in a Dutch-Indonesian publication with no obvious motive for fabrication. The United States Coast Guard referenced the case in an official publication 5 years later. These aren't the hallmarks of an urban legend that grew organically from sailors' gossip. These are the hallmarks of a real event that was reported, circulated, and then systematically undermined. There are 3 things that would definitively resolve this case. First, the discovery of additional shipping records that explicitly name the Ourang Medan and detail its cargo. These records, if they exist, are most likely in Dutch colonial archives, British Admiralty files, or American military intelligence documents from the post-war occupation of Japan and Southeast Asia. Second, the location and exploration of the wreck itself. The Strait of Malacca is one of the most heavily trafficked waterways in the world, but its floor has never been systematically surveyed for the remains of the Ourang Medan. Modern sonar technology could potentially locate the wreck, and deep-sea analysis could confirm whether the vessel's remains are consistent with a chemical explosion. Third, and perhaps most improbably, the declassification of any surviving government files related to the covert transport of Japanese chemical weapons in the post-war period. Such files, if they exist, would be approaching 80 years old. In many countries, the standard classification period for military secrets is 50 years, meaning these documents should theoretically already be available. The fact that they haven't surfaced suggests either that they were destroyed, that they remain classified under special exemptions, or that nobody has yet searched the right archive with the right keywords. The ocean keeps its secrets well, but archives keep them better. Somewhere in a temperature-controlled room in The Hague or London or Washington, there may be a folder with a bureaucratic reference number that, when opened, would finally tell us who sailed aboard the Ourang Medan, what they were ordered to carry, who gave the order, and why those men were allowed to die for the sake of a secret shipment of poison. Until that folder is found, if it still exists, we're left with the pieces we have. A distress call from a dying man. A ship full of corpses with faces frozen in terror. An explosion that destroyed every trace of evidence. Shipping manifests that suggest a cargo of chemical death, improperly stored, on a vessel that was never meant to be found. And a silence from every government that might have been involved, a silence that has lasted 77 years and counting. The SS Ourang Medan sank in the Strait of Malacca in 1947. Its crew died in agony. And then, as far as the official record is concerned, none of it ever happened. I've spent a long time with this case. I've read the original newspaper accounts, the Coast Guard reports, the skeptical analyses, and the 2023 archival findings. And I keep coming back to the same question. Not what killed the crew, because I think the chemical weapons theory is the most coherent explanation we have. But why, after all these years, does no government want to talk about it? What is so sensitive about a 77-year-old shipping accident that it still can't be acknowledged? Is it simply institutional inertia, the tendency of bureaucracies to keep secrets long after the reason for secrecy has expired? Or is there something else? Something about the nature of the cargo, or the identity of the contractors, or the destination of the shipment, that remains sensitive even now? What was at the end of that voyage? Where were those chemical weapons going? And what was someone planning to do with them? The men of the Ourang Medan took those answers to the bottom of the sea. But the men who sent them on that voyage, they knew. And their successors might still know. The water in the Strait of Malacca is warm and murky. Visibility is poor. The currents shift constantly, burying and uncovering the seabed in unpredictable cycles. Somewhere down there, in the silt and the darkness, there may still be the remnants of a ship that no one will admit existed, carrying cargo that no one will admit was shipped, crewed by men whose names no one will admit were lost. And maybe that's the real ghost story. Not a haunted ship, but a haunted silence. A silence that's lasted almost 8 decades. A silence that suggests the living have something to hide from the dead. So here's my question for you, and I genuinely want to know what you think. If the 2023 shipping manifests are authentic, and if the Ourang Medan was carrying Japanese chemical weapons precursors on behalf of an unidentified government authority, who was the intended recipient? Where was that cargo heading? And what does it mean that in 2024, no government has responded to the archival findings? Are we looking at negligence, a tragic accident caused by incompetent handling of dangerous materials? Or are we looking at something more deliberate, a shipment that was never meant to arrive, aboard a ship that was never meant to be found, crewed by men who were never meant to come home? What do you think really happened? Leave your theory below.